This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
These were my go-to questions. So if you've got one, flying around, I'd appreciate it. If you haven't, don't stress.
An exam question?
Yeah, some sort of question. And if you haven't,
What sort of questions do you ask them?
not too difficult. Or if you know of a case that is on point that I can look at and draw some facts out of, that would be great.
Okay.
And it's that, Phil, would you like somebody to help you with your science? And I said, I would, but I think it's unfair to the students if you have one because there may not be consistency. So, anyway, here's what it is. So, it's 25.
Are you recording this here again?
Oh, yeah. The first few weeks this was broken. So, turn that on, and I think it should be. I'll leave that to you, and I will introduce you.
Tricky to find a park here these days.
That should be fine. I actually haven't. I didn't go through it. Are there many changes?
No. They're the basic principles. The law moves at glacial speed, so I often change year after year. It's probably the examples that I talk to. That change. The risk allocation management. The principles are the same, but when you go out and you deal with the state, this is a different idea. Even now, in terms of how we engage with the state is changing again.
Is it?
The industry is trying to push back on risk allocation, and we can't take everything. So those are all practical things that will keep moving, but the basic principles
Make things the same.
haven't changed in the 20-odd years that I've been a lawyer.
I'll leave that to you. Let me introduce you. And then I'll pull up a chair probably a bit further up. Okay? Thanks for coming in on a cold night. Freezing outside, isn't it? Yeah, it is. Thank you. We're very privileged to have, not only tonight but for the next 2 weeks, Vinu Krishnan. As you can see by the details up here, she's the legal commercial manager of John Holland. She's going to take us through 3 of the topics to do with a bit of infrastructure, but the contract and risk management aspect of the built environment. If you have any questions in regards to anything that she touches on, please ask them. If you want to know anything about the infrastructure that is happening around Melbourne, again, Manil's probably one of the best people in Victoria to ask, which she's got the finger on the pulse in regards to it. So I'm going to hand you over to her to give her your attention, and I'm going to sit up the back and take notes and probably come up with a
Hello, everyone. Just to get a sort of idea as to who I'm talking to, who's worked in the industry? Who's worked in the industry in Australia? In what capacity? Development management. Anyone else? Someone over up there? No? Not wanting to disclose? Is there someone down here? No? Okay. All right. So today and for the following 2 weeks, I'm just sort of talking to you guys about construction law, and that's basically setting up what we're hoping to achieve at the end of this part of the course. You should basically have a basic understanding of construction law principles and how they relate to a building project. So I am a lawyer by background, but I do understand that you're not law students. So if it gets a little bit too legalistic, you can just raise your hands and just say, what does that mean? But I'll try and keep it as simple as possible, knowing that you are not law students. Be aware of the main project delivery models currently used in Australia. Be able to identify the basic key drivers of risk allocation in a building project. So risk allocation is always a big thing when you're starting out on a project and drafting contracts and negotiating a deal. And finally, understand the basics of contract administration. So that's basically when you've signed onto a contract, you're about to start the project. How do you administer the contract for the life or the term of that project? So there's 3 lectures today. We'll try and go through the introduction to construction law, the basics of it, and then basically give you guys a bit of an outline on the project delivery models and risk allocation. And then the next 2 will be the contract administration. So we'll deal with distinct sort of concepts that come that you'll find in a construction contract. So this is a building site, and can anyone sort of try and work out what's happening here? Yeah, so that's a level crossing removal project. If you all have been living in Melbourne for the last few years, it's a big thing. Who goes past a level crossing on your commute, on your daily commute? Yep, quite a few of you. 29 apparently have been removed. So it's a pretty big thing for this city to remove up to, I think the target is, it went from 50 to 75 level crossing removal. So I think inevitably, unless you live outside of the city, at some stage you will come across one of these projects in your daily commute. So that's this one is in Nunawading, and it's the Springvale Road Rail Separation Project. So that's maybe about 5 or so years old, I think. So as a construction, someone who works in the industry, these are the sort of things that would cross my mind as I look at that project. Site interface issues. So you've got the road interface. So that's this bit here, the rail interface, and then you've got all the other stakeholders that come into play. So utilities, the community stakeholders, all very, very important when you're running a project and trying to complete works in a very busy site. Then you've got design issues. These are sort of key things that you come up with when you when you work on a construction site. OH&S implications. Do you know what OH&S means? Can you just someone? Yes, that's right. Industrial relations. Do you know what that one means? Industrial relations. Anyone? Anyone knows unions? Do you know what unions are? What they do? So it's just basically anything to do with employment, okay, of human beings. So industrial relations.
Insurance implications, change in law, and one of the most important things is time constraints. So some of the handful of stuff that will probably just, sort of go through your mind when you're looking at that sort of stuff, that picture. So on almost every building site, you will find a myriad of project-related contractual relationships. You've got the builders, the project managers, and the subcontractors on site. And then off-site, you've got people like the financiers, insurers, and lawyers working to make it happen. So all of these contracts should ideally operate in unison. So they're all subject to a contractual mechanism, right? So the lawyers, the insurers, the financiers, they're all generally hired by the project owner. So whether it's a state or a private company, same thing, the principal will basically hire builders, project managers, and the main contractor will hire subcontractors. So what does a construction lawyer do? Anyone take a stab? Has anyone ever interacted with a construction lawyer? Nope. Don't know. We make a lot of money. No, we don't. So the construction lawyer's role is generally to draft project-related agreements so as to achieve the most or the best commercial risk allocation for their client. So their client could either be the one that's commissioning the project. So in the example of the level crossing removal project, the client would be who do you think the client is? The state of Victoria. Okay, so it's our taxpayer money that's perhaps you're not there yet paying taxes, but it's the taxpayers' money that pays for these projects. So the client is the state of Victoria. The client can also be the contractor who is actually doing the work, right? So a construction lawyer will represent just about anyone who's working in the construction industry. So it's you could have architects, engineers, environmental scientists, the client, the state itself, actual construction companies, even banks that provide financing. They're all represented by lawyers, okay? So apart from drafting the documents, those massive 100-page documents and compiling them, the other thing that the construction lawyer does is to resolve disputes involving the interpretation of those construction contracts. And generally, there will be specified mechanisms within the contract that will guide them as to how to resolve these disputes. So in the industry, there are terms that sort of describe this. So the front-end construction lawyers are the ones that deal with construction contracts, and the back-end lawyers are the ones that deal with disputes and claims. So construction law is largely based on understanding contract law and how it applies to construction projects. So what is construction law? What is this thing that we call the construction law? It's primarily sourced from common law, which is basically law made by judgments produced by courts. But it's also based on legislation. So this is when, the legislators come on board and politicians basically and debate and provide enact legislation. So some of the key legislations that we have in Victoria, the Building Act, the Domestic Building Contracts Act, and the Building and Construction Industry Security of Payment Act. So these are some of the more recent legislation that we have that regulates the construction industry. Secondary sources include construction law journals and texts, which basically summarize construction law principles. So unless you guys have questions, I'll just keep going, and every now and then I might throw some questions at you guys too. So are we all, any questions at this stage? Okay. Yep. Okay. So I'd like you to memorize this. No, just kidding. But a construction contract is an exchange of promises. So it's promises to produce a project for a price within a period. So you've got a promise, which is the exchange of promises, which is basically represented by a construction contract to produce a project. So what is that? To build something, right? For a price within a period. What's period? Time frame. So what are the key things that we've got here? Time and money. As a construction lawyer, you pretty much deal with time and money and risk, right? So it's some of the key things that go into construction contracts. It's all dictated by that. It's all sort of circles around those issues. So they're project-related agreements. So there's the main construction contract, but there are also other project-related agreements that are often found sitting parallel with the construction contract. These include consultancy contracts. So these are the ones that are used to hire consultants, for example, architects, engineers, various other project management related consultants. Then there's project management contracts, project finance contracts. So this is to lock in finance. And then you've got the downstream supply agreements and downstream subcontracts. So what are the characteristics of a construction contract? There are a number of special features that make them stand out. One of it is the right to vary scope. So generally when you make a promise, you make a contract, the perception is that it's locked in, nothing moves, right? You sign a deal, you have a deal, it's pretty much you know what that deal is. But under construction contracts, you could vary the deal, you could change the deal, you can change the scope of works that you're doing, and obviously you could change the price too, if that's how the contract reads. Provision of security. Does anyone know what that means? Provision of security? Yeah, financial security. You've got an independent administration of contract. That is, in principle, one of the expectations that you have, but more and more that may not exist, the independent administrator. Then you've got these little things called bills of quantities and schedule of rates. Is anyone familiar with those concepts or what they mean? There's some nodding over there. What is a BOQ?
It's basically a bill of quantities. So it's basically a measure of quantities to price of services.
Yep. And a schedule of rates?
I know they're intertwined.
Yeah, so one is actually, there's an element of quantity attached to it, and the other one is just pure rates. It's just the prices for, how much it will cost to provide this much, sort of materials. So that's the sort of rates that it has, or labor rates, or machinery rates. And the other thing that these construction contracts have is time-related performance and penalties. So time is a big part of construction contracts. It's a big element. So where do I find construction contracts? They're usually embodied in standard form documents. So in Australia, in my experience, we use a lot of the Australian standard form contracts. The short form for that is AS, and then you'll find numbers, so AS 400 or AS 4902 or AS 4300, that sort of thing. Then you also have Master Builders Associations and the RIA standard form contracts, and then you have the Property Council of Australia. The last two are more sort of domestic orientated, so in more commercial settings you'll probably find the Australian standard form contracts. They're continually updated and amended by the industry bodies, so there's actually an entity called Australian Standard, and they generally make those amendments. Continually updated doesn't suggest that it's on a regular basis. It's actually quite long between each update that occurs in the industry in some of these contracts. So what's interesting to note is that there's a lot of bespoke contracts out there too. So does anyone know what bespoke means? Yep. So it's basically tailored for a particular transaction, and it's basically written up by lawyers for that particular transaction. Often you'll find that the base document is like a standard form document, and then it's heavily amended via negotiations between lawyers to suit a particular project. So you'll hardly ever find a standard form contract that's used that hasn't been touched in any way and hasn't been amended in any way. But it's a good starting point. So yeah, I think over the course of the next couple of weeks we might talk more specifically about these standard forms. So we move on to risk allocation. Risk allocation. What do you understand by the concept of risk in a construction environment? Yes?
Basically, who's going to take up the risk, whether it's going to be the builder or the client or maybe someone else.
Yep. Okay, so it's about who is responsible for things going wrong. Yep. Okay, so what can go wrong in a construction contract? I mean, really? Sorry, everything. That's correct. That's a good answer, but can we just try and wake ourselves up and come up with some examples? Sorry? Time blowouts. Perfect. That happens almost 100% of the time. What else? Sorry, you were going to say something? Over budget. Here we go. Time and price. We've knocked off the first two big ones. What else could go wrong? Accidents. Yes, that's the third one. It's enormous, right? The accidents, fatalities and accidents. And again, it goes back to, lost time, injuries. You lose time as soon as someone gets injured or someone dies on site. Another factor that goes towards time blowouts, right? So you're not on program. What else could happen on a construction site? Yep, finance and workmanship. Workmanship is a huge thing. People forget about that. Poor workmanship causes a lot of problems, especially if it's not discovered once it occurs. Have you guys all been reading the news lately about, big apartment blocks falling apart? This is where a lot of you will be living, in high-rise buildings, and it's a real issue, very concerning. I don't want to be up, 15 floors above the ground level knowing that any moment something's going to fall apart. So, yep, workmanship, that all goes down to workmanship. What else? Policy change, yes, that does occur, and when it does, after the contract has been executed and you have an expectation that you are building according to a particular standard and it changes on you, it could cost you a lot of money. To meet the requirements of a policy change. Having said that, a lot of contracts deal with that possibility. What else? I'm talking policy as in the law changing on you, not just a sort of out there kind of policy, but more specifically laws and standards changing. What other risks are there? Yep, bankruptcy of downstream suppliers. It's an enormous risk, especially in a very hot market like where Victoria and New South Wales are going. The high demand raw materials. If the person that you're relying on goes bust, and you can't just move on to find someone else because the demand is so great to find a new supplier. It's a real issue. So you want them to stay afloat and stay alive. What else? Because they might take you down with them if they fall apart too. What other risks are there? Hey? Natural disasters. Excellent. I always wait for this because that's a real issue. Not just in the city, but particularly out when you're constructing huge projects that are out on a vast piece of land. What sort of natural disasters are we talking about? Wind, earthquakes, what else? Bushfire, very real. Cyclone, very real for Australia. What else that we... Flooding, yep, huge. So there's, you know, a rain event, a precipitation can cause a lot of havoc, right, for a construction site. Then, so what about the ground itself? Do you think that's risky business, the ground that you're building on? Why is that risky business? Okay, that's, yes, sinkholes, that's services, excellent. That is a very real thing in Victoria, services. Do we all understand what we mean by services? No? Who said yes just now? Someone nodded. Yep, all right, have a go.
So underground services such as like old services that is commonly developed old sewage supplies and
Yep. Pipes, yep, water pipes, drainage, electrical, your NBN cables, they're all part of utilities. Telephone wires, electricity, they're all utilities, underground and overhead also. What about contamination? Who lives out in the West? Yep, are you familiar with what's going on in the Westgate project? It's been in the news? No, not really. So they've dug up, like I just read a couple of articles that have popped out. They've dug out a whole heap of contaminated soil, and they need to know where to bury that soil after they've dug it up, right? So contamination is a huge issue when you start moving things and digging things up. A lot of the projects that's going on in the city involve excavation and tunneling. Where does all that soil go? What if that soil is contaminated? What do we do with it? If we didn't foresee it, or we thought it might be 10,000 cubic meters and it's 10 times that amount, 100 times that amount of contaminated soil, what do we do with it? So again, another risk, huge risk in projects. What else do you have? Sorry? Political unrest. Thankfully, we don't have much experience there, but some might disagree with the East-West Link project that was cancelled. Yep, but that's a real issue for a lot of countries, political unrest. It doesn't go through, a project gets halted. What else? Do you work in the industry? No, that's a very specific comment there. Reliability of geotech information. I feel like I could spend a whole day on that, but I'm not going to kill your spirits on that. So, but look, that is, yes, that's again. So, what's the sort of sense that you're getting in 5 minutes of me asking what are the, what sort of risks you might find in the construction, on a construction site? What's your sense? Yes, this is only scratching the surface, right? So do you then see why risk allocation is a huge thing? Right, so that's really what I want to try and get you to try and sort of think about when with this idea of risk allocation. So I've got a boring Macquarie Dictionary online definition there. Risk can be identified as exposure to the chance of injury or loss, or the chance that is accepted in commercial enterprise and considered the source of profit. So it's basically the process of identifying and understanding a risk. So what do you mean by the term understanding a risk? So you identify, we've just spent 5 minutes identifying risks. What is the other element of it, basically understanding a risk? Excellent. What triggers it? how do you prepare for it and how do you prevent it? So mitigation strategies. What's another element of understanding a risk?
Probability, likelihood.
Yep, the likelihood of it occurring. Bang on, right? That's very important in understanding. Why is that important? Who is that talking? Oh, right at the top. Why did you say probability / likelihood?
It's based on a risk matrix. We are likelihood the consequence and we actually quantify it.
So, okay, let me help you. So if the likelihood of a risk occurring is high, what would you do? How will that affect your decision making? On,
Try to mitigate.
okay. If the likelihood of a particular risk is high and the person on the other side of the table says, that's yours, by the way, what are you going to do? What's your natural instinct? No, thank you. Or you're going to probably say, that's $10 million for me to accept that risk. Right? So these are the possibilities of how you might treat that risk. Or you might say, so you price the risk, right? And so you basically, you identify, you understand it, and you determine the appropriate methodology regarding the treatment of that risk to minimize or eliminate that risk. So the likelihood and your ability to deal with it will inform how you will treat that risk. Will you price it, accept it, or will you reject it completely? Who is better handled to deal with that risk? Do you have all the necessary tools to deal with that risk? Maybe the other side is better placed at dealing with that risk, so just pass it back to them. All of these sort of things is what a construction contract does, right? It deals with all of this, you come to an agreement, you come to a landing on how risk is allocated, managed, and priced in a construction contract. So the aim of any risk allocation process should be to reach the most efficient risk allocation rather than for the stronger party to emerge with the least obligations in terms of risk. So this is utopia, right? But doesn't necessarily occur that way. So effective risk management is particularly important in the context of infrastructure projects. So we have this thing called the Abrahamson Principles. And this is, if you went to law school, you'd learn about it, but I've just sort of put it out there as just something to think about. So these are the core principles governing effective risk management. So it's within the party's control. The party can transfer the risk through insurance, and it's most economically beneficial to deal with the risk in this fashion. The majority of the economic benefit of controlling the risk lies with the party in question. To place the risk upon the party in question is in the interest of efficiency, planning, incentive, and innovation. So this is about driving a certain sort of behavior. And if the risk eventuates, the loss falls on that party in the first instance. Everyone understands? There are a lot of very sad, like really lost-looking faces. So I'll let you think about that. It's good to just, stew in that for a while. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask in the next couple of weeks. But that's been around for a while. The Abrahamson Principles. Every now and then, an upstart young lawyer might sit up there and go, and try and negotiate according to that principles. But in reality, things are very different, right? There's a lot of commercial elements that go into negotiating risk allocation in a construction contract. But it's good to have guiding principles. One way of dealing with risk allocation is delivery methods. So when you talk about delivery methods, it's basically a reference to a set of agreements which will be entered into by the parties responsible for the delivery of the project. It's basically the contract, and it's the structure that governs the relationship and allocates risks. So, for example, if you were hired by the state to build something, so let's say design and construct, which is pretty much a very basic and commonly used design and construct contract. So if you go and pull up an Australian standard form, it will have clear guidelines as to the allocation of the risks. So it tries to allocate risks on certain things in a very equitable way. You know, sort of, it's guided by, you know, for example, the Abrahamson principle, and says this risk is better placed with the client, and this one, the contractor should be able to wear it. But then obviously, as I said earlier, parties get together and they might change that risk profile to suit their needs. So, you know, the contract is generally a starting point, and standard form contracts have a good starting point. How many of you from civil law countries, so like Germany, Japan, Indonesia? So you're not common law countries, so you didn't come from Singapore, Malaysia, which... Turkey, I thought as much. So in European countries, they have this thing called FIDIC contracts, which is a French French origin. So that's another standard form contract that gets used in the construction industry, and so just to give you a sort of context, and there they will have, you know, they're color coded. These contracts are color coded, and they all, each of them will have different risk allocation depending on the type of contract. So you've got the silver book, the red book, that sort of stuff. So that's a starting point. So these are the main delivery models used in Australia. You've got the traditional construct only, DNC, which is design and construct. In large infrastructure projects these days, you've got the PPP model, which is the public-private partnership. There's this thing called the relationship contracting, which is the alliance model. It's a new invention, newish. And then you've got early contractor involvement, which sort of then leads to a DNC or a construct only, but mostly a DNC. And then you've got various other forms of hybrid delivery models that combine hard dollar and relationship models. So the hard dollar is basically a reference to, you know, the sort of lump sum, fixed scope, fixed amount contracts, and the relationship models are more like the alliance model. And they are hybrid versions that are floating around in the industry, and they're interesting to navigate. So, what do we understand by construct-only contracts? Anyone ever worked on a construct-only contract? Yeah? Sorry? Yeah. So traditional, when you build a house, for example, you know, the client would have hired architects and engineers, structural engineers, geotech. They would have done everything, and then they go out to tender or to market with that package. So you've got all the information that you need. All you have to do is build the structure. So yeah, a lot of standalone building contracts can operate as construct-only contracts. So the designer is engaged by the owner. The owner retains significant control over the final product. It's a slower process than DNC. Why is it a slower process? Yep. That's right. Yep. So you've got to complete the design, and that's a lengthy process. You know, so you've got to get to that end stage of the design, have IFC drawings, and then only you can go out to market. So slower in terms of the owner, so they don't get to get theirs, engage a contractor until it's all finished, the whole package is completed. but lends itself to easier finance. What does that mean? Sorry? Yeah, banks, that's right. So when they can see a completed design, drawings, all done, as far as a banker goes, he or she can say, it's less risky. I know exactly what this thing is going to look like. It's not going to evolve. And ideally, that means that the cost of this project is not possibly going to blow up because we've already dealt with a huge part of the variables in a construction contract. So they say, all right, this little package, we know it'll be worth $1 million. Okay, so we have a little bit more control over it because one big element of it is completed. So they're willing to lend you money if there's some level of certainty. And no single point of responsibility. What does that mean? So if you go out to market for a design and construct contract, you basically hire the one company and they do everything. They design and they construct the project. Whereas if you go out to market with just a construct-only contract, you as the owner will have to deal with the contractor, you'll have to deal with the designers and all the other ancillary consultants that inform that building package, right? So you can't just say, I've just hired construction company A, you deal everything. Anything goes wrong, you're in charge. We're going to blame you. We can sue you. Okay? So with a construct-only contract, you've got to work out, was this caused by a dodgy design or a dodgy build? And it could be both. So you have to sue two different parties. So that's for those of you who deal better with a visual like that rather than words. So that's a construct-only contract. So you've got the principal, the owner of the project, and the financier, design consultant, contractor, and then a subcontractor. So with a design and construct contract, we've covered some of this. The contractor is responsible for both the design and the construction. It's usually a fast-track process, so the principal will come up with an idea and then requirements. So it's just very sort of, I want to say sketchy, but it's actually a lot more than sketchy. So, it's like an outline of their requirement for this project. So let's say they might say, and I'm just really simplifying this, I want a 10-story apartment block. The top two has to be penthouse. I want this many car parks. I want it to have a swimming pool, tennis court. I want the bathrooms to be decked out in this level of quality of finish, that sort of stuff. They may specify all of that, and then you go in, you design it, right? And meet these concept sort of design, requirements. So as far as the owner is gone, it's fast track because they've palmed it off to you, and then you go and solve that problem for them. There's buildability synergy. What does that mean, buildability? Yeah, so often you find if there's one person designing, another person building, the person who comes and takes the design and goes, that's all fabulous, it looks amazing, but it's actually going to be really difficult to build, or it might not work on this soil condition. So there's a lot of things that go into buildability, right? We can't actually build to this design. So there's some architects out there that have these amazing sweeping structures or, cantilevered platforms, and the structural engineer's going, this is an absolute nightmare. My professional indemnity insurance is not going to cover this. Or the builder might say, it's just impossible. 10 people might die before we build this thing, right? So do you understand? So it's amazing on paper, but we couldn't possibly build it. So the synergy is that you send it out to one company, and they solve that problem between design and constructability or buildability. You get that synergy from the one-stop shop. So there's less control over the project by the owner. So, yeah, in the sense that the architectural design element. I'm not really sure how that's true, and I sort of question that that concept as less control. I think the project owner will always have control over the project and its requirement. But in the sense that it's less control is that you have less interaction with all the other disciplines that inform that project, because you're only dealing with the one, so you don't have direct contact with an engineer or an architect or a designer. So that's basically what that model looks like. So there's the financier, and then you've got the contractor, and you deal with design consultants and some contractors. So those are pretty, sort of bread and butter kind of basic contract models or delivery models that you have there. And then come the really big and wonderful and complicated and very sexy aspect of construction industry, which is a public-private partnership. Everyone wants to work on a PPP, and then everyone gets slightly soul-crushed at the end of it because it's all-consuming. They're massive projects, right? Can anyone think of PPPs in this state?
Tunnels or bridges?
Yep, the Westgate Tunnel is a PPP, and what else do we have? The Metro.
Freeway extensions?
The freeway, which one?
Eastern?
East. Yep. So the Northeast Link extension that's going out, that is being procured as a PPP. What does that mean? PPP. Public. I love the way you pointed at him. Not me. He said it. What does that mean? I mean, apart from reading the slide. Okay, so how is it different from any other project between the state and a private entity? Sorry? The public ends up, that's a cynical view, so I'm not going to pay attention to that. But really, how is it different? Yes?
Private sector provides the initial capital.
Yes, so the private sector actually puts in money. It's not just taxpayer money. There's private equity that finances these projects. So it's a partnership. It's a financial partnership between the private sector and the government. So the basic framework is to involve private sector in the government's discharge of its social obligations, including sector reforms and investments being achieved. So it should basically involve allocation of tasks, obligations, and risks between the public and the private sector. The general expectation is the private sector brings in all the expertise in terms of construction, engineering, and commerce. And then the private sector can provide capital for investment, local knowledge, and political support. So it's a very simple way of describing PPP, but it's a far more complicated beast. If you ever have the opportunity to work on such a project and be part of setting up a PPP, it's a great experience, but forget about going out on Friday night drinks and taking your dogs out for walks, and that's a cynical opinion. They're huge endeavours. Why should a government opt for a PPP, as we've already discussed, to attract private capital investment? Why would they want to attract private capital investment? Sorry? It looks good on their books. Another cynical view. Sorry, what was...
government doesn't have to pay for it right away.
Sorry?
So the government doesn't have to pay for it straight away.
Yep, so that's a less cynical view. The government doesn't have to pay for it. But more often than not, they are so hugely expensive and amazingly risky sort of endeavors that you want to attract private capital. So, for example, the Westgate Tunnel project, do we know how much it costs? Does anyone read papers, or are we all on Twitter with Trump? We love it, don't we? 140 was it, or something like that? So it's in the billions. It's in the billions, right? So we're talking multi-billion-dollar projects, and often the government, state or federal, just don't have the money, so they attract private capital. Why wouldn't you? A lot of these private capital are flush. So who would sort of be involved in this? Might want to invest in these sort of projects when you talk about banks, superannuation. Why would you do it? Because you're going to make money. Yes, that's not at all a cynical opinion. That's absolutely correct. You're in it just to make money, right? You wouldn't do it otherwise. So to increase efficiency, so often these projects, they come from design, construct, and then they go into the operate and maintain phase. So when you operate a large infrastructure, like a toll road, where do you make your money? So that's a long-term proposition that you're dealing with, right? So like tolling companies. So that's where you make money, and you've got sustained. As far as a large, like a company goes, that's where you have, you know, your income, your passive income. Once you've locked it in, you just basically, it just ticks over for the next 5 to 10 years. Fingers crossed, obviously, that all things go right, and you've got your actuaries has kind of worked out that this is a good proposition, right? So, the other reason, which is less cynical but very true, is to increase efficiencies. Because they're such large projects, it's better to just engage with the private sector, bring them, have some skin in the game, bring them into that sort of framework, because they have the resources and the skill set to carry out such a complicated project, and to reform sector rules such as policy making and service providers. So that's just a little bit out there compared to the immediate requirement of building an infrastructure for a country or a state. So the primary advantage is delivery of value for money outcomes for the government, so you get competitive tenders. The expectation is that everyone will be providing you with a good price to participate in the PPP, that the general sort of expectations is PPPs are often delivered earlier, they're more customer focused, they're broadly funded, so it's not just taxpayer money, and they're better equipped technologically. So they're all really good projects that it's a fantastic way to deliver a huge infrastructure. So to just go back to what a PPP might look like, and the contractual matrix. So you've got the state, and then you've got a project co, which is set up to actually basically carry out the project. And then you have the construction company, various other service providers, you've got the equity provider and the financier. So this is a very basic and simple model. You'll find that a lot of PPPs are actually a lot more complicated than these, and they're deeds and agreements flying left, right, centre between all those sort of actors in that PPP space. So we've talked about the Westgate Tunnel project and the Melbourne Metro project. I've provided some links. I don't know if they're still valid. So that came about last year. So they all sort of happened last year. There'll be more that'll come out in the next 5 to 10 years. And I've just created a link there for examples of other PPP projects in Victoria. So it's not just tunnelling projects. You've got hospitals. What other projects that could be delivered, have been delivered in Victoria as PPPs? Prisons. Okay. prison projects, public hospital. What else? Yeah, I can't think of an example of a school. Who said school? Which one? Right. Which school project was many schools? Are you talking about most of the schools? Okay. I can't verify that, so I'm gonna take that and think about that one. But yeah. So look, some of the large, hospitals and prison projects have been delivered by PPP, and various other infrastructures also, like desalination plants. That's the ones that occurred. So those are probably more like 10 years old. So then we move on to the next model, which is the relationship contracting. Just give me a second. I'm moving along pretty quickly, guys. So what do you understand by works against your gain is my loss theory? So in a traditional model, yes?
These alliance, my gain is your gain, my gain is your gain. Under alliance, it's pain share.
Pain share, gain share. That's it. He's got the lingo. That's right. So that's absolutely right. So in traditional models, if you lose, I win. If I lose, you win. Right? That's basically how it flows. So to sort of not want that, and we all sort of have a situation where we all win together or we all lose together, so we share our pain, share our gain, they came up with this model called relationship contracting. So it includes a wide and flexible range of approaches, so true, to managing principal and contractor relationships. So alliance contracting is probably the best example of a relationship contracting delivery model. So some of the level crossing projects that you guys, that you find around the state have been delivered under an alliance model. So how is it different from traditional models? So traditional model, you've got a fixed price, a lump sum price, and in a relationship model, it's replaced with a performance-based remuneration. So you get remunerated your direct costs for whatever reimbursable costs, basically, for whatever you incur. And then there's an element that you will agree, a percentage for profit, or may not necessarily be a percentage, actually an amount. And then on top of that, you've got a pain share, gain share regime. So who was that who knew? How does the pain share, gain share regime work? Do you understand that? Yep, have a go.
It's there's a target outrun cost, so you're going for a target cost. So if the project goes up over the TOC, the target cost, then you go 50-50 on the paying side of it. So you lose out with the contractor, the client loses out, and if you go under the TOC, then you share the profits.
Okay, so that's a really good explanation. So TOC, the target outturn cost. So when you start the contract, you set a TOC, which is a target. Okay, let's just say the target is $100 million. So you basically all sit down and agree, you've done your budgeting and you've done your pricing, that pretty much that's the target. Let's all agree on $100 million. You start the project and you start working on it. You come to the end of the project and your actual outturn cost, AOC, let's just say it's 100 million. Is that pain share, gain share if it's equal? No, right? But if it's 90 million, you're 10 million under, right? What do you do with that 10 million? You share that. But if you're 120 above the 100, your TOC, if your actual's above that, then you share the pain, you split up that pain. 50-50 is fabulous, but it's never ever the case, right? Generally, the contractor wears a little bit more. There are other more complicated mechanisms on how you would share pain and gain, but that's a very basic, simple way of explaining and to sort of get the idea. Yes?
Is there a way to sort of combine this alliance contracting with PPP when it comes to critical infrastructure, when it would require like, you know, more social responsible than like sort of
Yeah, it's, you know, alliance works because it's a really good question, but it's just, it drives different behaviors. The PPP is driven by the fact that it's funded by state and private, right? And there's a very specific kind of behavior that you want out of a PPP model, and it's a risky element. So you choose one or the other, right? PPP or an alliancing. But having said that, often, and there are instances lately that you have a PPP model and then downstream they might engage people in a relationship style model. Right? So that has happened, right? But at the top level, the actual, what we talk about as PPP, it doesn't work that way. That's more or less, it's a reference to a financing model, right? So yes, an alliance or a relationship model could exist within a PPP structure. But then it's a very different risk allocation that you will have. It's not a hard dollar DNC contract or a downstream contract. You'll be driving, there'd have to be really good reasons to get into that sort of model or alter the risk allocation mechanism, right? So it also has this concept of no blame, no dispute clauses. So there's a real, you don't go and sue each other. Of course, there are always exceptions to that rule, and it's normally things like willful default or fraud. So there are exceptional circumstances where you might sue each other. So generally, you try and resolve it within the alliance itself. So there's an alliance management team, an AMT, that administers the contract, so it's a day-to-day stuff. And there's an ALT, an alliance leadership, that basically makes the decisions about the functioning of the alliance. So that's basically a model on how they sit together and they work. So what sort of projects is an alliance contract best suited to? We say complex projects in terms of risks, interfaces, and stakeholder issues. So as I gave right at the start, the example of the level crossing removals, they lend themselves to this idea of an alliance being quite useful way of delivering those projects. And there's also the idea where the scope of work is not sufficiently defined to allow accurate pricing. So you have like a target price rather than a fixed price, so that's where the target comes into play. And they're required to be delivered on a tight time frame. So the fact that you might be able to share on some gain it probably will motivate you to try and complete that project cheaply and quickly, more economically, and projects which will benefit from innovation and value adding. So every time you value add or you innovate, the idea is that you save money, so you'll keep coming lower than your target. Okay, so I've said there the level crossing removal projects, so there's some elements of the Melbourne Metro Tunnel projects have been delivered as an alliance. So you've got the Rail System Alliance, and then there's the RIA, which is the Rail Infrastructure Alliance. The System Alliance is basically to do with all the black art or signalling and all that technical stuff, and the Rail Infrastructure Alliance is the team that's currently working near Chapel Street. They're doing a lot of work around that area there. So then you've got types of contracts. So you've got, this is basically pricing models for the contract. So you've got the lump sum. So you basically sign on to the fact that you are going to deliver the project for a lump sum. Okay, that's it. It's 10 million. That's all you're doing. Or a cost plus, where you agree that it could be whatever it costs, right? Plus your profit. Then there might be schedule of rates. We talked about that. So it's based on a schedule of rates. So every time someone wants you to perform some works, you go to the schedule of rates as a reference on how much it's going to cost. So you're guided by a fixed set of rates you've agreed to. And then there's the bill of quantities. So a lump sum contract is basically a fixed price to perform the works. You'd only be able to vary it if there's variations. So what exactly are variations?
Change of scope.
Change of scope, yep. So change of scope, what else would trigger a variation? Unforeseeable circumstances. So if there's, if you've previously agreed that a certain soil condition should be expected, but if it changes, then yes, that could trigger a variation. What else? It's mostly scope driven, right? And there's a few other elements that could drive a variation. They're generally not subject to rise and fall of labor, material, and various other things. What's rise and fall? Rise and fall. Does anyone know what? Escalation? You know what that is? So let's say in January 2019, you know that you've got this contract to build a 10-story apartment block. So you go out and you source cement, okay? And you're going to pay $10 for a load. I'm just keeping it simple. By the time you get to June, the supplier says, actually, it's going to cost you $50 a load because he can do that because there's a lot of demand. You know, it's a big thing. There's thousands of projects. Everyone wants, my product. So, and if the contract says, that's it. You're not those sort of movements. You can't come back and claim on us. So you wear the extra. Yep, so what was the extra amount? $40, someone was paying attention. That's right, because I'm very specifically, if you guys are like, I'm losing you. So $40, you wear the extra $40, and that's a huge amount of money if you are building 10 stories and 6 months into the project, it goes up $40 for each delivery. Let's say you're getting 100 deliveries. What is 40 times 100? Sorry? $4,000 a day extra, right? So that's going to hit your bottom line and you'll start losing money. Soon enough, your margin is gone. It's dissipated, right? So it's a risk, rise and fall, and often the client will say, that's your risk, right? You deal with it. And it's a real problem if the market is volatile and it's hot. So you'll have to build that. You've got to anticipate. It's going to cost me $10. These guys are saying it's going to cost me $10 in January. In all likelihood, it's going to go up to $50. How would you deal with that? Well, it's one way. So you're sort of, yes, you're sort of preparing for the worst. You add a contingency. Sorry?
Like a construction contingency or project.
What does that mean in real life?
So it's just like an extra, I don't know, percentage, so like 5% project or 5% construction.
What do you add? Where are you adding this to?
So
You're adding it to the price that you provide to the client, right? So you're saying, in today's terms, it's going to cost me $10 million, but in all likelihood, I'm going to wear an extra $1 million because of potential rise, not fall. So I'll whack it in and it becomes $11 million. Thank you very much to carry out this project. Just in case it's going to go up, and I predict that it's probably going to go up. If you were a client, what would you do? Actually, let's put in that rise and fall clause. Yep. No, why? It's a lump sum contract. You priced it for $11 million. You win. So, do you see what I'm saying? So it works both ways, right? So it's a question that you ask yourself: does it work against you or for you to have a rise and fall? It could work for you if the contingency is pretty healthy, but it may not work for you if you blow out that contingency, your price. So again, risk allocation, right? So the main advantage is cost predictability. So as far as the client's concerned, I've signed a contract for $11 million. I'm going to get financing. It is $11 million. So that's the predictability that they have. So lump sum contracts are suitable for construct only and design construct contracts because they generally tend to be quite a fixed, predictable scope of work.
Can you link the price to CPI or like commodity prices as it goes up?
Good question. So yes, if there are some very enormous fluctuations, what product could you think of in construction industry that goes like this? Steel, coal,
Cement,
oil, copper. Anything we haven't covered? Labor.
all of it's
Sorry? Labor tends to fluctuate. So one way of dealing with this is you lock in the price with your downstream suppliers. You say for the next 12 months, you only get to charge me $10 per delivery versus $50 per delivery. That's one way of sorting that out. Right? Yes.
If you are the client
Yep.
and you choose a tender where there's a clause that, if prices go up on concrete, for example,
Yep.
you have to bear that cost. But how would, say for example, every other builder has priced it for $11 million, knowing full well concrete's going to go up because of whatever reason. How can you make that informed decision as a client?
Yeah, it's a risky thing, isn't it? How much would you pay for a crystal ball? None of us do, right? So you make an educated decision as to, where the trends are going in the market. Is it worth just to pay that $11 million and have certainty? Or maybe it actually benefits me to just see how the market plays out, and if it goes up, then I pay. But if it doesn't, then I don't have to pay. So, alternatively, if you take that risk, it could be more than $1 million. It could go up to $2 million if you allow a claim for a rise and fall. So they're all good questions. There's no fixed answer. Okay, so it all depends on where you're at in every. So this is what makes construction industry very, very exciting and very, very risky. Yeah. So we talked about cost plus contracts. These slides are just basically giving you, a little bit more information than what I just saw. So you basically get paid for the actual cost of construction plus a percentage for your profit or your margin. So it's not very attractive if you are the owner of the project because there's no certainty of final cost, and it's often hard to find financiers for these sort of projects. Then there's the schedule of rates, and they're normally used for smaller, discrete sort of works where the nature of a particular item of work is unclear, but the sort of quantity, volume, or extent of it is not. So it's we've talked about the fact that the difference with bill of quantities is there's no statement of quantities, right? It's just prices, it's just rate. And with the BOQ, one of your classmates has just basically correctly pointed out it's a statement of the units of work, the quantity, Yeah, you know, it's generally used in tenders. It's a lot of lump sum contracts include BOQs and schedule of rates. So in case there's a variation, you can rely on those schedule of rates or BOQs. So which project delivery model is right for you? Maybe this is an exam question. It'll depend on a number of factors, such as the developer's sensitivity to time and cost overruns, the size and complexity and duration of the project, so the design time available, the degree of control you want over the project, and the third-party interests, so your financiers. And then you have the next question is which contract form is right for you. Again, it depends on the project you have. How much do you know about the scope? How much control you want over the design? And would you prefer the builder to just carry out his work and provide you with keys at the end? So keys at the end. Have you heard of this concept of turnkey? We don't use it in Australia much, but you know, if you go to other countries, you know, they have the turnkey model. It's basically everything done. You just have to go and turn the key and bam, it's all done. So that's what it means by provide you with a key at the end. It's all delivered and you just have to cut the red bow. We're done. So, do we have questions? Which one? Alliance. Yes, so there is an element of reimbursable costs. So you agree what your RCs are, your reimbursable costs, and then you have a second limb, which is basically your entitlement to profit. And then you sort of gather all of that and set a target, and you basically try and achieve that target. Yeah.
What's the distinction between bill of quantities and schedule of rates?
So bill of quantities has quantities in it,
Schedule of rates.
and the price, whereas schedule of rates is just prices, just rates. For,
Even a lump sum contract, if the client don't include the rise and fall,
yep,
and if the certain price of a certain product goes up,
yep,
there's a high possibility that the builder could go bankrupt
yes,
and the whole project will be in jeopardy.
yes.
So how do they mitigate that? It's even the if the builder go bust, then
It's not ideal, is it? Yeah, so that's when you negotiate. You come and talk to each other again and you find a solution halfway through the contract, right? This is the beauty of construction contracts. You're always in conversation with the contract, and these sort of things do happen. And you're right, it's not good to have your builder fall apart, to go bust, right? It's a horrible scenario because then you have to deal with the fact that you're going bust. Then you have to hire someone new to come and take over the project, and that generally means it's going to cost you more, and you have nowhere else to go and seek this cost. In all likelihood, you're also trying to grab some money out of the creditors who are circling around that bankrupt contractors. They're probably suppliers and subcontractors who haven't been paid, who are now coming back to you because they've supplied stuff to your project. So it becomes a really complicated issue. So it's in your interest as a principal to make sure that that company stays afloat, gets the job done, gets out of there, right? Go and get bankrupt and fall apart on your own time, right? Not on my project time. So yeah, that's when you hire lawyers, try and find a solution. And it could be as simple as we'll just give you a variation, or it could be a lot more complicated than that. Okay? But if a company is going under, it's going into administration, just to be technical, human beings go bankrupt, corporations get wound up, they go into administration. So when they get wound up or they go into liquidation, that's another term that we use, it's generally triggered more than like, you know, issues of rise and fall. They're sort of more deep-seated like issues that are going on with that company and its management of its risk. Yeah.
Another aspect of that is who's responsible and up to what point. And if you look at the large projects that Vinu was talking about, if you look at the basic house builder, he goes broke. You usually find that the frame and everything else stays pretty dormant for quite some time. The second builder says, I'm not responsible in the future or moving forward for anything that's been done now. Oh, and by the way, I have to fix this, and this, but I still want no responsibility for what comes of it, and it creates problems in that regard.
So you've lost all your warranties and that sort of stuff. So you've got no one to sue for that element of work. They don't exist anymore. So yeah, it's counterproductive to try and kill a company. Yep.
You think about the tunnel project. Now we step into that. And I did hear, and I hope I'm right. We ran out of concrete in Victoria. We had to source it elsewhere, at the mercy of the supplier. Basically charge what they want. So that's just part of the risk of running it all.
Yep. So yeah, so there are sort of those complicated elements, and someone mentioned policy. So one of the policies that the Westgate Tunnel, fell foul of was local supplies, so steel. There was a certain, and this was in the press also, that there was a commitment to source this amount of steel from local suppliers, and I think the contractors there went out to an international supplier, and they were then held to account for not complying with the local sourcing policy requirements. So, but they're like, we've got to build this thing. There's not enough steel in this country, right? So what do you want us to do? So it becomes, there's every day in a construction project, especially something as large as that, there's like hordes of people solving problems. So I have to say, having worked in the industry for 20 years, it's very exciting if you like problem solving and being under a bit of stress.
One out of left field from the Vinu. You mentioned the apartments.
Yes.
Cladding. Who do you think is going to be responsible for that other than the government saying, we'll foot the bill, which is the taxpayer?
Yeah.
Because the cladding that's been put on, which was clearly flammable and a problem, who initially said that quality's okay?
It's the people who are in charge, the policymakers. They're the ones who drafted standards, So they have to take responsibility, and it becomes a huge human safety issue. So that's why they had to cop it.
Yeah.
So they're going to change all those standards and those requirements. It's extraordinary that cladding was allowed, and what's far more extraordinary is it's in first world countries, so not just Australia. You saw it happen in London, and who knows? It might be in so many other countries that was allowed that we haven't heard of. So. That's.
And then think about the poor people that, the unfortunate people that have bought an apartment, moved in, only to be moved out shortly thereafter because there's major cracking and issues, and somebody's gone tick in a box to say it's okay.
Yep.
Actually heard a comment the other day from someone I was talking about it, and they said, oh, it's actually my father-in-law. He used to do quite a bit of development. He said things started to go bad when independents could sign off on the work, and the councils basically divested their responsibility for checking that everything was okay. And he was just in residential. So if that was what it was in residential, it may have just flowed on. I don't know.
So the flammable cladding is this era's version of asbestos. Basically, obviously the asbestos issue was huge. It was, various other sort of construction-related dodgy practices. So who knows what we might find 20 years from now that might be a huge problem. and it might not come from the pure construction phase, but technology phase, things that may interfere, electromagnetic waves or something like that, so things that we take for granted now, which is convenient for us, like mobile phones. 20 years from now, 30 years from now, someone would have been working, on a research and come up with something, and it becomes an issue again. So it's, this is part of forging ahead.
Yeah. Asbestos, go back 30, 40 years ago, asbestos was the wonder material.
Yep.
Until we all found out how dangerous it was. I suppose in that regard, we've got the unions to thank for the effort they made to have it treated the way that we look at asbestos today. So, but it was a real problem. But nobody thought it was at the time. So, it is, we do things now, or industry does something now, and it's okay. 10, 15, 20 years down the track, who knows? And once again, the winners will be the lawyers. Works every time. Any other questions for Venu? No? Okay. Thank you very much, Venu. We look forward to the next few weeks.
Thank you.
And we'll see you next week. And I will put something together so we'll stay on next week, okay?
See you next week.
Okay, thanks, Venu. See you.
See you.